So our speaker tonight is Carolyn Knowles, and she has had, from before her birth, a long relationship with the town of Alliston. In 1860, her great-great-grandfather bought a parcel of 100 acres on what is now Highway 89 north side, with the Nottawasagas on the south side. And then that land, I guess, was given to his son Andrew, who then homesteaded there. So that was all on her father's side of the family. And then on her mother's side of the family, her mother was a kindler, K-I-N-L-E-R. And the kindler, K-I-N-D-L-E-R, was named incorrectly after the family. So her mother's side also had strong roots in the community. And then her mother and her father met in school and went to school together, got married, moved to Toronto, had Carolyn, and then when she was 5 months, they returned to the Alliston area. And she has lived in the same house ever since in Alliston. And now that house is full of the work that she's done over the years, collecting information on Alliston. She said she's got enough for maybe 4 books. The first book is coming out in, I don't know, how many days? November 7th, there will be a book signing at the Museum on the Boyne. And so books will be for sale at the museum. And also then on starting November 10th, they'll be for sale at 41, which is the gift shop for the South Simcoe Arts Council, and also at the gift shop in the Gibson Centre. I'm sure I've got more than that written down here, so I'm not quite sure what I missed. Did I get everything? Yes, so yeah, okay, got all that. So what I wanted to say is that Bert Platt has been our beaten historian for many, many, many years. And I think it's fair to say that Carolyn is the Alliston historian. If she doesn't have it, probably nobody does. I sent someone to her who was asking me for photographs of Alliston, and she found some. So somewhere in her house, she might have what somebody needs. Anyway, so gives me great pleasure to introduce Carolyn Knowles, and we can all enjoy her talk on Alliston.
Thank you. I have something to show you, which I just received this afternoon, and it is I have just written a book, which is what this presentation is basically about. And I have in front you're the first people to see it, is the history book that has just come out that I have written. Alliston on the Boyne, the legacy of the mill town. It's heavy, unfortunately. It's 335 pages, and it's library quality, so it can lie flat wherever you are. And it has 22 pages of citations and 15-page index. So if anyone wants to argue with me, they have to look at the citations first. So I just got that this afternoon, and it's hot off the press, and I'll be getting 1,000 copies in my garage before November the 7th, and that's when they go on sale. Unfortunately, in this day and age, it ain't cheap, so it's $70 for a book. All costs are in. That's the total cost, and I couldn't do it any cheaper, and that's not paying for everything. So I'm going to speak tonight on the history of Alliston and what I've written in the book. So let me just fire up the technology here and get started. Now, do you want me to speak with the microphone?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's good. Speak into the microphone, yell at me if I'm not. All right, so the history of Alliston. Just hang on, I'm just going to move this a little bit. Is that in your way? Okay. Our history starts with the Fletcher family, who came from Alliston in Yorkshire in England. And they left in 1819, as far as we can ascertain, accompanied by the Monkmans and the Dales. Those are names that I suspect some of you will know. Is that am I okay? Good. And they came into Canada, eventually into Ontario, and eventually into South Tecumseh. You might be aware of the Monkman Cemetery. That is the remains of all of their activity on the third line of South Tecumseh. William Fletcher was one of the 3 Fletcher boys that came, and along with his 2 brothers. He married. He farmed on the 13th. He farmed on the third line, the 14th, lot 14. He had 3 sons. And in the mid-1840s, he decided that they weren't going to keep farming, and he wanted them to do something else. They understood there was a need for a mill in what is now Alliston area. And so, without milling experience, he and one of his sons came up in 1847, and they discovered a mill site they thought was appropriate in Alliston. For those of you who know Alliston, it's all centered around what is now the pedestrian bridge just down from the Hospital Hill. And the first mill site was there. Anyway, they came into town in 1847. They built some sort of shack in order to manage for the first while. The rest of the family came up, and 2 other sons and Mrs. Fletcher. And they, by 1849, had started to build the Fletcher House, which is the Fletcher homestead, still standing on Fletcher Crescent, 44 Fletcher Crescent. Of course, it didn't look like that in 1848 and 1849, but that's how it looks today, and it's still in its existence. So once they got the house, they had a sawmill operating at the time, which allowed them to build the house and to make some income as well. They got busy, and they started building a dam and a bridge on the mighty Boyne, and this is what it would have looked like. Perhaps not quite this in 1853, but that's when the mill first started operating, which is on the right-hand side. And this is looking up the Boyne River, and I'm going to run out of hands here.
So you mean west?
Looking west up the Boyne, yes, because the Boyne flows this way off the escarpment. And this is the Hospital Hill. It's a lovely pointer provided by my host. This is the ball field over on at Riverdale Park. And this is the mill race that they use to channel the water in to power the water wheels. That's the mill as it looked when it was first built. These other buildings were built later. Fletcher Crescent is up behind, and you can see the water tower way up at the top. That was put up in 1892, but that's basically where today's water tower is, so just to give you an idea of where it's centered. This is what it looked like along the Fletcher Crescent. This is about from the bottom of the Hospital Hill, where the Hospital Hill is today, and that's what it looked like looking upstream to the King Street. And if you stood on the King Street Bridge and looked downstream, this is what you saw. Hospital Hill. This is the United Church spire. It was the Wesleyan Methodist Church at the time. This is the bell tower for the town hall, which was situated where the administration center is situated today. This is the bridge over the dam where I just showed you from. This is the vehicular bridge. Wouldn't have been a car bridge in those days. And this is the mill, but it hardly shows up in this photograph.
The river's not that wide now.
No. They dammed the river to make the mill pond. Yes. This is a view from Victoria Street looking to the north up to Fletcher Crescent. This was taken about 1920. So the mill pond was and this is the Grant House. The Fletchers left for Alliston, and they didn't, as far as we can ascertain, they had never milled in their life. So they hired a gentleman named Alex Grant, who was a known miller in Centerville, which is south of here, southwest of here. He came up, and eventually his family moved up, and the Fletchers built him this house. It was moved to this location from just the top of the hill from the mill. It was torn down in 1964, unfortunately, but their first daughter, Margaret, was born there in 1853, and Mr. Grant stayed in town till about 1860, and then he moved on to other mill sites, and then he eventually settled in Tottenham. And his daughter, Margaret, met the little farm boy next door, William Banting, and they eventually married, and their fifth child eventually became Sir Dr. Frederick Banting, and he was born at the Banting homestead up on the third line of Essex. And so Sir Frederick Banting's mother was born in this house. In 1964, the owner he suggested the town buy it because of its history, and the town wasn't interested, so it was torn down, and this is now the site of Burns Flowers on the main street. William Fletcher's middle son, John, was running the flour mill, and in 1858 he built his house on Fletcher Crescent, 18 Fletcher Crescent. It's the second house on Fletcher Crescent as you turn off the Church Street Bridge if you're going towards the hospital, and it's still standing, 1858. And it was renovated beautifully and sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars a few years ago. John Fletcher would be surprised. George Fletcher, the eldest son, originally moved out east of Alliston and set up a lumber mill right across from where the Volkswagen dealer is today, on the river. It eventually became Tours Mill, for anyone who's familiar with that name, and it became a flour mill. But in 1883 he sold it and moved into Alliston and built the east half of this house, where just east of where Banting Memorial High School is today. He sold it in 1910, and the new owner added the other half, and from that time on it was known as the Castle. And everyone talked about the Castle because it was quite a magnificent building. Unfortunately, Banting needed to expand in the mid-1960s, and they put this up for sale in 1968 and asked if anyone would move it off the property, but they didn't get any takers at all, not one bid, and so they had to demolish it. So the castle went down. But this was the first house for many decades that people would see as they came into Alliston. Everything got built and then it all got taken down. So these are just a variety of activities that took place in the mill pond. The mill pond was just sort of the center of all kinds of stuff that went on year-round. This is swimming. These are docks that came off the Fletcher Crescent side of the mill pond. That happens to be my mother standing on the left. Obviously, I'm in the family photo album. A bunch of kids on the boom logs that were just ahead of where the water fell over the dam. Those are the houses on Fletcher Crescent. And again, this is the hospital hill without a hospital. In 1935, my grandfather was W.J. Cunningham, and he was the Reeve for 15 years, and he was also the mayor for a couple of years. But in 1935, he was also the miller, so he had the river rights and the mill rights. So he was in charge of the dam. He and a friend of his, Mr. Hipwell, who was a long-standing druggist in Alliston, decided that something needed to be done for swimming facilities in the pond. So my grandfather, who was an inventive sort, invented what they called the swim crib. And it was a framework that he designed with supports that came up. They were about 2 feet high at the front, but about 7 feet high at the back. And as they somehow ran it into the muck of the mill pond, it gave an even profile on the top of the water. And it was all wrapped in chicken wire, including the bottom. And I met a lady in the 1990s who remembered, she said, that's where I learned how to swim. It was so safe in there, I just loved it. And so the swimming crib was very famous. It was written up in the Toronto Telegram.
Were they worried they would go over the dam? Is that
Yes. Yes, because there was a flow once the river got to and the boom logs kept, a lot of, it was some form of protection, but the fall of water wasn't that far ahead of the boom logs. Mr. Alliston lived in what is now the third house from King Street in Victoria. The Dairy Queen is kitty corner. Third house in on the north side. He was quite taken with the willow trees along at the back of his property that were along the shoreline of the mill pond. So he created Alderson's Beach. He must have had a great time. The willows, of course, are all nice and soft, and they had flies in at that time too, I believe. It must be summer in the photo. A little boating went on at the pond. This is fishing below the dam. Now there's a good fall of water there. This is, I expect, is the spring runoff. And these are the kinds of fish these are sturgeon that they pulled out at some point. I don't think it was the same time as the other photo. The salmon are running now. The salmon they're about 24 to 30 inches, but they're spawning all up the Boyne River right now, and they're splashing all over the place. And they're starting to smell because they're starting to die. And then the ravens come in for a little snack. This is my mother skating on the pond in 1929. And way down there in the background, to give you some perspective, is once again the spire on the Wesleyan Methodist Church, or the United Church. The ice harvest took place annually, as it did, I think, on most mill ponds. And the ice was taken off in great big blocks. It was put onto drays and pulled off the ice and stored in different facilities around town in sawdust with the hopes that it would last the summer. If the ice wasn't sturdy enough if they were afraid the dray was too heavy, they would cut channels in the ice and float the ice to the shore, and then load them up on the drays and get them into the sawdust places. Okay, so 1912. For most of the time, the Boyne has flowed, and it was dammed in Alliston. There were no dams further upstream, so that when there was a spring flood, it would come rushing down off the escarpment and all down through the countryside. And even when I was a kid, there was the Oro Dam wasn't in place, so there would be big, huge chunks of ice come down the Boyne in the spring flood, and it would jam up against the bridge. And they'd crack and they'd pile up, and I always thought it was very exciting. However, it wasn't that exciting for the bridges. So in 1912, the dam went out and the bridge went out. So they had a statutory holiday, and they invited everyone in the town that was capable to come down and help clean the bottom out of the muck, all the stuff out of the mill pond bottom, get rid of tree stumps and everything else, anything that had sunk to the bottom, and it was considered a very successful workday. So they built a bridge. It went down in 1926. So my grandfather built this bridge. He built two. He separated the vehicular traffic from the pedestrian traffic. Cars had been invented by then, so I guess he wanted the pedestrians to be safe. In 1942, it was a huge spring flood, and in the newspaper, for all my research, I read 4,000 Alliston Heralds on microphone. And so I'm not doing that ever again. And I remember the description, and it's in the book, of course, the description. My grandfather was the miller, and he had said the structures are not going to last. The water's too high, there's too much ice, and sure enough, the dam and the bridge all went out, and this is what it looked like. And this over here is the opening to the mill race, which is where they control the flow to go over the water wheels for the flour mill. They also had a sawmill as well. Now this isn't a particularly refined photo, but this shows the river. This is how close it used to flow to the back of the buildings on the north side of Victoria Street. There used to be a road behind the buildings that had eventually eroded away. And in 1942, this is just all the debris from the bridge and the mill pond mixed with ice that were all that close. Anyway, they figured out that my grandfather didn't immediately rebuild the dam. There was all kinds of conflict around what they were going to do. This is how, it's still emptying out there. Must have been a very sad day in Alliston to look at that. Also, just while I have a reasonable photo of it, this is Stevenson Memorial Hospital, which was built in 1928. It was funded by T.P. Loblaw of, yes, Loblaw's heirs and all the rest of it. And he funded it to a tune of $100,000, along with a gentleman named Frederick Keenan Morrow, who was born in Alliston, but his ancestry was back into Agila. He provided $20,000, and the hospital opened in June of 1928, at no cost to the taxpayer. So once the dam was gone, they had to build a bridge. So this was the first bridge, and it wasn't that great a looking bridge. And sure enough, this was put up in late April or 1st of May. Another bad storm in June, all the water came rushing down, and the little bridge went out. So my grandfather said, okay, well, I'll build a second bridge, and then he built a walkway so that you could at least get over the mucky parts of the mill pond. In the meantime, they decided they weren't going to reinstitute the road over the dam if the dam was ever built. So that's when they first built the Church Street Bridge. Until that time, there was no crossing there. So this is the first car to cross the Church Street Bridge in 1943. However, there was still a problem getting over the Boyne. There was always the concern of people having to get to the hospital and walking, because of course lots of people walked in those days. And you either had to go to Church Street or down to King Street. So my grandfather decided to build a bridge, and he said it was only good for 5 years. And he put it where the dam used to be. So the bridge stood, and at the same time he decided, well, here's a golden opportunity. This is the mill pond bottom, and he decided, well, this is muck from 90 years of accumulation. He decided to turn it into a potato field. So you can see the hospital on the hill. There it is. They're harvesting the potatoes, and this is what they harvested.
Whoa.
And people in town in 1943, 44, whenever this was, it was around that time, I don't know exactly, said they were the largest potatoes they had ever seen. And that's my grandfather, very proud of his crop. So the poor old bridge, this is a spring flood. There was a spring flood every year, but this is a spring flood of 53, and things were getting a little weedy, and they finally said in 1954 that the bridge was going to have to come down and get replaced. However, in 1954, Mother Nature looked after that for them. The bridge collapsed. So they then decided that they needed to change the course of the river. So if you're in Alliston, in the parking lot next to the Mill Pond Cafe, that goes down as far as Mill Street, which was where Lewis's Details used to be. You are walking on the former red riverbed. And they moved it over to where the mill race had been, and then they used the river gully as the local garbage dump for 5 years. And it was smelly, and sometimes it caught on fire, and there were rats in it, and everything else, but eventually they filled the river gully, and they built a bridge over the new river course with a dog leg in it, because it was cheaper than filling in around all the land. So that was Fletcher Crescent in 1955, and that's what the mill pond looks like today. If you come across the hospital hill is back in behind the trees. The hospital is away up in here, and Riverdale Park is on over there in the pool, and this walkway goes down off the pedestrian bridge and goes down as far as the swimming pool. So it looks better. No potatoes. So, church history. There were all kinds of religious groups in Alliston. The first ones to organize and build a church were the Presbyterians in 1862. And this church was built across from the Mill Pond Medical Center that's there today. And if you're ever there and you look, there's a slight rise in the land, so it's sat up on a bit of a hill. Very pretty little church. They added to it. It was called the North Half and the South Half. And they had a manse built in 1876. It's long gone. In 1915, they decided to build a new church. So this was the Knox Presbyterian Church on the same knoll. and again with the manse beside it. Now there was the church unification with with the Methodists and the Presbyterians in 1925 to form the United Church. And as many of you would know, many of the Presbyterians did not wish to join the United Church, and so they carried on as their own religion and own sect, I guess it would be. And so they needed a church because they got kicked out of Knox Presbyterian because it became Knox United. So they built another church on Wellington Street, just across from the administration center. The building is still standing. And it was called Chalmers Presbyterian Church. And they were there for many years. However, in 1951, the United Church finally decided they had continued to own both of the buildings, the former Presbyterian Church and the Wesleyan Methodist, which became St. John's United. They decided to put it up for sale. It had been empty for a year, and a local congregation of Pentecostals had been meeting there. So they offered it to the Chalmers Church. And they said, do you want to go back to your old church? And they actually had to think about it for a while, and they eventually decided they would move back. So they moved back to their old, lovely church, and it had chimes in it that used to ring through the town on Sunday mornings. But unfortunately, a cold, bitterly cold night in January in 1976, the church caught on fire. And which is why you no longer can go along Main Street and see it across from the medical center. And this is the next day when it's all shrouded in ice. And it was torn down, and then following that, the Presbyterians moved to their church to King Street, where it is today. The Methodists, the founding family, the Fletchers, were staunch Methodists. They first met in a little hall that they built, just down from what it was Details and Lewis's. But in 1873, they opened this new church, the Wesleyan Methodist Church. Put up the manse 10 years later, and they had a shed at the back where the parishioners could park their horses during church service. The Anglicans built their first church. They started meeting in early 1860s, but they didn't get a church built until 1876 on Wellington Street, which is where the current building is, which was built opened in 1927. The Catholics built a church in 1876, just west of where the Bantam Memorial is now, St. Paul's Catholic Church. Unfortunately, by the 1990s, it was deteriorating to the point where they were told they had to take it down. So the church was taken down, as was the manse. So it is no longer there, and at that point, the Catholic congregation built a new church on King Street as well. We also had Mormons in the area. The Mormon religion was established in 1830, sort of southeast of Rochester. By the late to mid 1930s, there were sightings of Mormons in South Tecumseh. And it was very ominous, and they weren't too sure about all this. Anyway, the Mormons hung in, and they eventually had a congregation that was large enough, and they built a church at the corner of Albert Ontario Streets in Alliston, which is, if you remember where the mill was that burned in Alliston, it was just east of there. They established in 1881, and they went defunct in 1891, so they only lasted 10 years. And apparently, some of them moved to Utah. There's rumors that the other half became Presbyterians, but I don't know that for sure. Anyway, a gentleman bought, Mr. Lee, a grocer, bought the building, and he moved it up to Main Street. And eventually it was all covered up. It had a false front, and it had insul brick on it. And it sat there until 1995. I just lived down the hill and across the bridge. I could see it out my bedroom window. And I never knew it was a Mormon church. And even in the 1947 history that was written of Alliston, there was no mention of it. So it sort of got hidden behind insul brick and forgotten. So in 1995, they were going to take it down because that's when they were starting to establish the Mill Pond Medical Center and getting started on things. It was offered to the town. The town didn't want it. So they started, as they unclad it, the church windows came into view. And on one of the boards, they found Tuesday, April the 26th, 1881. And so their building was destroyed, and the Mormon history was gone forever. As I say, it wasn't here for long anyway, but it was just interesting that they were here at all. So in the early 1900s, evangelical folks started arriving into town. A small, very small Pentecostal congregation formed, just a small group. They met in houses for a while. They eventually were allowed to rent the Presbyterian church owned by the United Church because they didn't want it anymore. So they were there when the Presbyterians moved in from Chalmers, and then the Pentecostal congregation bought Chalmers Presbyterian Church on London Street East. It became Alliston Pentecostal Church, and they were there until the mid-1980s when they moved into a new building up west of Alliston on top of the hill. And since that time, it's been a daycare center, but the building still stands. Yeah, also, in about, I think it was 1929, the Alliance Church representatives started arriving in town, and they first met on the second story of Tom Brooks Ford dealership. So this is Tom Brooks Ford dealership, just at the top of the hill up from the footbridge, and they had tent meetings. They were in town for about 10 years. And they met in some hall someplace. They just said they met on Main Street. Everybody apparently knew where that was. But they would have tent meetings, and they had a great big tent on the corner by, you could think of Shoppers Drug Mart and Center Street, and the large parking lot in behind across on the west side of Center Street. They used to be down in that neck of the woods down there, and they would leave a piano. They left a piano in the tent all summer. I mean, would you do that today? I don't think so. Anyway, a gentleman named Joe McCarroll, who was a butcher in Alliston for many years, lived on the south side of Wellington Street. And he said, in the middle of a summer night, about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you'd hear the piano playing. Well, apparently there was a bake shop just to the north of the tent, and the baker worked all night. So I guess he, as Joe says, I guess he got everything in the oven, and he couldn't resist going over and tinkling the ivories. And he'd say, well, you know, it sounded very nice, but we really didn't appreciate it in the middle of the night. So they left town and eventually came back and reorganized, and this is the Alliance Church at the East End of Alliston. It was put up and it was opened in 1983. They also had gospel workers that met. It was a religion that was sort of started, I think, on the Bruce Peninsula, and they would advertise camp meetings, but there was a small group that met again in people's homes in Alliston. They eventually joined with the Church of Nazarene, and then we had another small group of Church of Nazarene people meeting in Alliston. And they only lasted until the mid-1960s, and they disappeared. The Peace Chapel at the corner of Wellington and Paris, it was evangelical. They were linked to Billy Graham Ministries. The building's still there today. The Baptists came in the 50s. They didn't really get it together. A new group came in the 70s, and eventually they built this church out by across from the cemetery on the east end of town. Christian Reformed Church, the huge Dutch migration that came in from after the Second World War. Many settled in this area, as you would probably know. And they first started meeting in the Masonic Hall in Everett. And then St. David's Anglican Church kindly allowed them to the use of the nave of their church on Sunday afternoons. And then they went to an abandoned church in a place called Sisterville. And of course it was called Sisterville because who lived there but the sisters. And it's on the second rise of land west of Alliston. If you go up past the Highway 50 intersection and the next rise of land, that was Sisterville. It was even a stagecoach stop way back in the 1850s. And when they accumulated enough money, they built the church on Downey Avenue, just east of the high school, in 1962, and have been there ever since. Jehovah's Witnesses first were
sort of gathered together in Alliston in the 1940s. They eventually found a place in Nicholston to meet. And in 2008, they built this new church on the south end, on Church Street South in Alliston. So the schools, our first schoolhouse, 1862 or 3, just in behind Lady Di's Flowers, just west of the high school. They soon outgrew it, and this was the Alliston Public School and high school. First floor was the public, and the second school was the high school. The front section was built in 1885 and then eventually added onto. This is on Albert Street, which is where the school was for many, many years. Nice looking old building, different additions. This is a fire chute. This dates to at least 1948 because that's when the fire chute was added. They finally decided it wasn't safe on the second floor after the 60 years. So they added a fire chute. And there was great hilarity, of course, trying to get up inside the fire chute. When they tore the building down in 1967-8, they sold the fire chute to Santa's Village in Bracebridge. And that's what the building looks like. It was boarded up, and it's now being converted into the new Tecumseth Administration Center. Banting Memorial High School, that's what it looked like in 1950 when it first opened. And in 1960, the first Catholic elementary school was opened, St. Paul's Catholic School, and on the same property as the Catholic Church, which was again just west of the Banting Memorial, and it is now the current site of the Banting condos. So the Banting condos take up the whole acreage that the church owned for the church, the manse, and the school. And the Christian school started, it was established in the late 70s, and eventually they built a new building down on the town line south of Alliston. This is the Alliston Post Office. It was built in 1892. And it was owned by Joseph Whiteside, because postmasters had to own the facility before they could be allowed to be a postmaster. And he added an apartment at the back, this is the extension at the back, so that's where he raised his family. Unfortunately, it was deteriorating, and it was no longer a post office. In 1940, Mr. Whiteside had died, his son had taken over, but there was a rule that postmasters had to be veterans, and the feds would not listen to even a petition that went in from the town pleading that the son Gerald should stay on as postmaster. So when he moved out, the building was vacant. The new postmaster went elsewhere in town, and eventually the switchboard for the Bell Telephone Company came in here, and it was there until Direct Dial came in, and the Bank of Montreal built the building, and that's now the Bank of Montreal building, where it's located. The Alliston Herald was first started as the Alliston Star in the 1860s, lasted 3 years, went defunct. But George Fletcher owned it, and he was really keen on bringing a railway to town. So in 1871, he re-established the Alliston Star and pleaded his case along with the town fathers about getting a rail line in town, and it did work. Eventually he sold the paper, and the new editor called it the Alliston Herald. It was eventually moved to the main street, basically across from the theater and the library, and it was in this building for 90 years until it moved south to the south part of Alliston. And unfortunately, about 6 weeks ago, the Alliston Herald just died, and it is no more. This is an ad in the Alliston Star in 1873. Hooray for the Alliston Railroad, the railway is coming. Well, they thought it was coming, but it didn't quite get there then. It didn't get in until 1877, in December. And it was called the Hamilton and Northwestern Rail Line. And the main line came up from Hamilton to Barrie. And the branch line went from just north of Beacon at Allamill up through Alliston as far as Glencairn and eventually on to Collingwood. And it changed Alliston as the coming of all railways did to all small towns. This was the rail station. In 1988, or 1888, the Hamilton and Northwestern was purchased by the Grand Trunk Railway. And this station was it was at Ontario and Albert, with the northwest corner where the Mormon church was. On the southeast corner, if there's an angled road that goes around to the Gibson Center, the angled road follows the line of the rail line. And the station was down in there. And this is the first GTR engine, the train into Alliston in 1888, after they had bought the line. Early 1900s, the federal government was making plans to have a rail line going across Canada, but they wanted to build a new rail line out of Toronto to meet the east-west line. So the original line was designed up through Tottenham, Beaton, Nicholston, up to Baxter. Well, the Alliston Poobahs decided that they didn't like that. So about 1903, they jollied themselves down to talk to Mr. Shaughnessy in Montreal, who headed the CPR at the time, and convinced him to change the course of the line. So it comes up through to Alamel, and then it makes this lovely gentle curve up to Alliston. This is building the bridge over the mighty Boyne, just at Victoria Street. And if you ever notice, as you cross the tracks and look up, if you look to the north, it just immediately turns back and ends up back over near Baxter, where it was going to be in the first place. So Alliston expanded that much more, and of course Nicholson did not. When the rail line, in 1871, the population of Alliston was 250 people. With the news that the rail line was coming, no guarantees, just the supposition it was, like 1874, there were 800 people and it was designated a village. By 1891, it had 2,000 people, and it was designated as a town of Alliston at that time. But that was just the influence of the railway. This is a CPR station. It was on Wellington Street, basically behind the Shoppers Drug Mart parking lot, if you can look at the back side, and on the other side of the street. Lovely old station, the agent lived there. Southbound train going to Toronto, more colloquially known as the city. And it was people went up and down. They just used it like a bus service almost. It was very handy. This is the CPR. This is the Grand Trunk station. Again, from the other side. This is the horse-drawn taxi from the hotel. They'd come down. They'd either bring their passengers down or pick up some. Figure it's a nice mix of transportation. The train. A couple of Fords, I think those are, and the horses were still employed as well. In 1922, the rail line was purchased by the CNR, Canadian National Railway, and it was the CNR from then on. Unfortunately, this was a branch line. It went to Collingwood, and eventually there was rarely any use made of the rail line. So in 1954, the CNR announced that they were going to close the branch line. And it was incredibly sad. People gathered at all of the stations to say goodbye to their friend. And they were just used to they would call it the Grand Trunk up, the Grand Trunk down, even though it had changed to the CNR. And here's a farewell sign from the people in Creemore, because obviously they come down from Collingwood. And the report in the paper was that there was a large gathering here in Alliston to say goodbye to the train. And of course, the CPR station, the CPR eventually stopped all passenger traffic through Alliston, so there was no point at the station. And so it was abandoned in 1986. Jim Brown in Tottenham purchased it, and this is him getting ready to move the station down to the 6th line, where east of the Tottenham Road, where he converted it into a residence, and it's still there today, I believe. Yes. And they found a stone marked 1906 on the foundation, which is when the building was built. Banking came into Alliston. The first bank came in 1878, the Ontario Bank. The reason I included this photo is because this is July of 1906 in preparation for the Orange Parade. And communities took turns having the Orange Parade. It'd be upwards of 5,000 people would attend. So this is a wreath of boughs of trees that they had, I think there was 4 of them along the main street. But inside the bough over here, this is the Home Bank of Canada. And it came to Alliston in 1906, eventually moved across the street. But if you go into Contact Clothesline, the used clothing store, and you jolly yourself to the off to the left over to buy yourself some toys, you'll be in the bank vault of the Home Bank of Canada that was built in 1906. So I guess the vault was there to stay, so they just used it as the toy room. The Bell telephone, it first came into town in 1885. The telegraph preceded it because, of course, it came in with the rail service, because that's how they communicated. This is Mr. Hipwell. He was the telephone agent for 64 years, and he took over in 1895 and moved it to the back of his drugstore. So this is a famous photo of the switchboard in Alliston. Now, in late 1850s, they prepared to go to direct dial. And on January the 2nd, 1959, at 2 o'clock in the morning, and no one in town was to lift the dial. They were not to be that curious. The mayor made the first unassisted long-distance call from Alliston, 2 o'clock in the morning, and he called his favorite teacher from the early 1900s who had moved to Toronto. And apparently they had a great time between all of the staff and the Bell staff and the town staff and the whole project of getting the whole conversion done, that all the ladies were given red roses and they partied all night over a telephone. 1891 was the Great Fire in Alliston. This is looking basically from the roof of Details, Lewis's Hardware. This building here is now the Windsor Medical Center, or Health Center, whatever it's called. If you go into the audiology, it's a good stick, thank you very much. If you go into the audiology clinic, which is on the east door of the front of the building, this angular area here is still showing, it's all filled in of course, but it shows the damage from the fire of 1891. It was the Queen's Hotel, and then it was rebuilt as the Windsor Hotel. And they have photographs of the fire on the east wall, which is very neat. To give you some perspective, this is Victoria Street and this is Church Street. This is the southeast corner of Church Street, the sign on the building. And this is the Wesleyan Methodist Church, the St. John's United. And according to the parishioners, it was an act of God that it was saved because the wind changed and blew across the road. But the fire started at the back of in the sheds of the hotel. It followed the river all the way back to the United Church, and then it crossed the street as far as the First Street to Wellington, and went out over past where the tracks are today. They weren't there at the time. 30 acres were destroyed. This is standing basically in front of the United Church looking west. This was the first Bank of Hamilton building that was destroyed. This building over here was the Temperance Hotel. It's put up by that good temperate man, George Fletcher. And if you'll notice, there's T's in the brick design to remind people when you walk in the hotel, there's no drinking. It was destroyed. The blacksmith shop lasted, it had hung in, and stayed open until the 1950s. This last picture, if you can imagine standing at the main corner at the Mattress World, Briscoe's Mattress World, that's looking down through that entire block. The houses at the back are at the south side of Wellington Street. So total devastation, but they built some shanties and they got started, and by 1894, the Globe and Mail came up and did an extensive article on the phoenix rising from the ashes and how the town had recovered. We had a brickyard at the time out behind the museum, and they supplied hundreds of thousands of bricks, and the town survived. After the fire was in 1891, just after the town had become a town, at which point the town fathers thought they should have a proper town hall. They hadn't had a town hall before then. So this was Alliston's first town hall, which is where the administration center is today. Bell, complete with bell tower, and the opera hall on the second floor. Raised seating for 300 people. And that was the main community hall for years until the 1940s when it was condemned. Finally, in the 1960s, they said you've got to take the bell tower down before it falls down and kills somebody. So they finally took it down in 1867. By the way, the fire department was originally in the bottom. It was a market hall to start. They'd open it up every Saturdays and Wednesdays, and people would come up from Toronto with goods and take stuff back, and Eaton's and Simpsons were up here buying and all the rest of it. And then eventually it was the fire hall. And in 1970, they decided they absolutely had to take it down. So down went the old town hall. There were 6 chandeliers in the opera hall. They don't know where 5 of them went, but one of them, in a circuitous sort of way, left town and came back, and in 1999 was hung in the museum on the Boyne, and it's hanging there today. Beautiful chandelier. It was originally gas-fired, and then it was electrified. The bell was taken over to the museum, and it sat there for 40 years, not doing much of anything. And in 2003, when the Gibson Center was being renovated as the Gibson Center, they asked if they could have the bell. So when you hear the bell ringing at the Gibson Center, it's the town bell from 1893. And of course, that's our beautiful town hall today. Architectural gem that it is. Because of the fire, they decided they needed waterworks. This is our first pump house. And you wonder how the dam ever survived anything. When you look at some of these photos, I'm thinking, my good Lord. It was the first pump house, and then they put up a water tower. And that's basically where the water tower is today. That's the nurse's residence. That wasn't built until 1938, but it's, so the photos later on. That's a brick structure with a wooden top on it. And they had to go down inside there and try to clean it. They couldn't get it clean one time, so they used some sort of tar or Vaseline or Varsol or something. And the townsfolk noticed an awful flavor in the water for 4 or 5 days. And they thought, oh my God, it's wonder they lived to tell about it. So that tower was replaced in '49 with that one. And then most of you will probably have seen the edifice that now graces the hospital hill. The nurse's residence, just so you know, it was built in 1938, and it is currently being torn down for the new hospital. They've started on the interior, and they think in the next month that it will be taken down in its entirety. Unfortunately, it was matching what the original hospital looked like, so it was sort of one remembrance up at the hill, but it's going down for progress. The pump house eventually became the PUC building, and this is a new bridge across the mighty Boyne, where the dam used to be. The dam never was replaced, as you probably figured out, and that's what it looks like today, the Mill Pond Center. Times do change. In 1888, William James Fletcher, who was a grandson of the founder, his father John ran the mill, decided he was really interested in electricity, and there was talk across the province of electricity being available. So he decided he'd open an electric light plant at the bottom of the mill, and it was too dusty, and within 2 years he decided to move. So he built a second mill across, and he was still using, there was a water wheel in here, there was a water wheel up above, and there was a water wheel here, so he was able to take advantage of the power. So he generated power, and he was also burning wood. You can see the wood piles back there as an alternative fuel when the water wasn't flowing. So he built this in 1890, but there was such a demand for electricity that he eventually built the third electric light plant just on the other side of the mill race. Now, just so you know, that my house is currently on the property just here. And I'll tell you why I'm telling you that in a minute. So this is the interior of the electric light plant. And there were huge belts. This was a huge belt here that produced the power for the town. And that was the sole supply of electricity until Ontario Hydro came in in 1918. This is what the building looked like on the outside. And this cement block building here was built as a coal storage plant. And when Ontario Hydro came in, of course, the electric light plant was no longer in effect, so they were getting rid of all the stuff on the property. So they put the building up for sale, and Hutchison and Foster were building the Alliston Creamery at the time. So they dismantled the building, and if you ever go to the Alliston Creamery, maybe you're looking at some cement blocks from the coal storage place, from the electric light plant from 1914. So the Alliston Creamery is still in existence today, as you know, slightly larger than 1919. Now, north of this building, there was fairly vacant land. It was used for storage and whatever. So in the early 1900s, the Alliston Lawn Bowling Club started. They had 2 greens there. They were lighted. Of course, they were handy with the electric light plant. And there was articles in the paper about the lawn bowling going on. So in 2010, I was having a new sewer line put in my front yard. And someone came to me and they said, we think there used to be a road here. And I went out and I said, oh, good Lord, it's the lawn bowling. It got green. And they used the cinders from the furnaces to grind the base for the lawn bowling, for the green. And it's still there, and I'm still digging up cinders. When I said it was the lawn bowling green, the guy said, no, I don't think so. And he felt sorry for the owner, that she thought that maybe she was a little wacko. Anyway, he laughed, and another guy came up and he says, I agree. He says, that's not a road. I said, I know it isn't. It's the lawn bowling club. So it's underfoot at my house. Local constabulary first hired a policeman about 1880. This is Robbie, who was very well known and well liked in town. He was with this force from 41 to 56. His name was actually Elmer Robbins. He had one flaw, well, maybe more than one, but one main flaw when it came to being a policeman. He couldn't drive a car. So the town thought about, he was having trouble, running from the Riverdale Park where there was trouble down to the East End, and he was trying to chase the cops and the robbers out of town and all the rest of it. So the first vehicle for the police department was a bicycle. But when Robbie left the force, they bought the first Alliston police car. And it was used. And if you just look, there's a building back in here. And from about the early 1900s until about 1950, it was the Alliston jail. And they were getting ready to tear it down, but they couldn't tear it down because there was a dog in there. And the dog was in there because it had bitten the police chief. And they had to figure out what to do with the dog before they could tear the building down. And then they tore the building down and they built a fire hall. And it became the senior center, and it now holds offices for the town hall until they moved to their new building. Street names aren't very clear, I'm sorry, but it gives you some idea of the main street. There's the tower from the bell tower from the town hall. Wooden sidewalks, muck all over the place. Now this is a photo that was taken from what we presume was the water tower. And it was taken about 1905. Shows the mill pond. There's the Presbyterian church. Here's the Gibson Center. It was an implements factory. This is the public school and high school down here. This is the mill. This is the mill race here. This is the bridge over the dam, over the dam. This is the mill, the flour mill. It burned in 1911, so, but it was a going concern. It, drew people to the town in the first place. This is the sawmill over here. This is the Windsor Medical Center up here. This is Mill Street, and way down at the far end is where the Catholic Church used to be. And this is all Fletcher property along here. This is Fletcher Crescent. And this is the Fletcher homestead in here, and then John's house was further on down. But that's the town as it looked in 1905. This is the main street about 1930. This is the post office building. And then the home bank moved across the street and built this bank with a lovely front on it. Became the Bank of Toronto. Main Street about 1950. Alliston's first traffic light, 1958.
5640.
There you go. That's how I dig photos. I have to go on and I can change all the years until I find a car that looks like it. Oh yeah, that's 1950. All that block of building is still there on the left side of the photo. It's Paul Gastaldi's office, and that building was put up in 1892 after the fire. There's a fairly long chapter in my book about Sir Dr. Frederick Banting. This is the Banting family. Sir Frederick and his assistant Charles Best trying to find a cure for diabetes. He founded the insulin was actually manufactured in 1921. In 1923, Banting and the rest of the people that were involved were awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology. And Banting Homestead just held the 100th anniversary on Saturday, celebrating the award of his award. He was the first Canadian to receive the award, and he is still the youngest person to ever receive the award for medicine and physiology. Sir Frederick Banting, this is the last photo taken of him. He was enlisted by the provincial government, the federal government, to work on germ warfare and other kinds of warfare at the beginning of the Second World War. And because he had a lot of secrets and things that he wanted to share with his compatriots in England, he was given permission to fly on the Ferry Command, which was how they moved the airplanes that were manufactured in the States over to England. They flew them from Newfoundland. So he got as far as Newfoundland, waited for the storms to clear, and he and his pilot and the two other gentlemen in the plane took off, and within about 30 minutes there was engine trouble and they crashed. The other two men were killed. The pilot lived. Frederick Banting was badly injured and he died the next day. They were found about 3 days later in the snow north of Musgrave Harbour, which was northwest of Newfoundland Airport, which became Gander Airport. And his dream was always, Fred's dream was always to come back home and spend the rest of his life painting. But he died at age 49. And he even told them at the control center in Newfoundland Airport that he was going to retire as soon as the war was over and get out of the business and just paint. And he was going to come back and buy the farm south of the homestead, which is now the Mattamy subdivision. And he was going to have Thompson, who was living at the homestead at the time, look after the farm, and he could just paint. This is from the family album. This is on Christmas of 1922 outside the farm. You know, his friend must have been in a hurry because he's got his bedroom slippers on. And those are his brothers, Kenneth and Nelson and Thompson. And that's A.Y. Jackson. And they are on a boat heading up into the Arctic in 1927 at the behest of the federal government to investigate the welfare of the Eskimos, the Inuit, and also work with the RCMP. And every waking hour that they weren't busy, they were busy painting. And then he learned how to carve. And the farm is known for having a lot of artifacts on it. Indian artifacts, they're called, but you know, from encampments 8,000 years ago. And he was quite taken with that, and he learned how to carve. And this is one of his carvings of the artifacts that he found on the farm. And that, my friends, is the end of my presentation.
What's the current population of Alliston?
You know, that's a good question. Because I think new to Tecumseh, isn't it?
Yeah, not
22 or 25 or something. So I think Alliston's maybe 10 or 12,000.
I think it comes at
It's
39. 39.
Oh, it's 39? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
maybe 15, but I really don't know. Because I don't know where they've actually recorded anymore.
Yeah, they don't, it's by municipality, so it's not.
The 2021 census says that Alliston's population is 23,000 as at May 11, 2021.
Alliston is?
Or they are doing.
I don't know if that's specifically Alliston.
Oh, interesting.
When they built that dam the first time, there weren't too many people here. How many?
There was no one.
Yeah.
And they would have come here, most of them, they were all farmers, and they were mostly in Essa. And West Essa was a small community. If you go up the Scotch line, which is Boyne Street, I know I name all these names, and I don't remember where they are, but Boyne Street is just west of the high school. It's where the Esso station used to be. It's called Boyne Street, and then when you get up to the town limits, it's called the Scotch line, because that's where all the Scotch people were settled. And on the first crossroad, just up north of Alliston, which is the 5th line of Essa, was called West Essa. And they had a couple of churches, a general store, but nobody had a mill, and they didn't really have a water source up on the hill. It was, it was on the Boyne. And the fellows apparently carried their grain to the Red Mill in Holland Landing. Now, that's a bit of a trek. And they apparently just carried it on their backs, and they crossed the Nottawasaga on a raft, and they had to go through the swamp, and I tramped uphill to school and back, and it's just one of those stories, but it sounded terrible. And as far as we can ascertain, all of the farmers here also went to the Red Mill. I think it was called the Red Mill. And so I surmise they used to be so busy. I think there's a story printed about the road between Bond Head and down through to Bradford. They were lined with people waiting to get their grain ground, and I think it was it done through you folks? The story, the Bond Head Road or something?
The Plank Road.
The old Plank Road.
Yeah.
Was that not related to the farmers getting their mill, their wheat milled, I think? So anyway, they were going away down there. So we figured William had to go over there as well. And if you're all standing in line, well, what do? We gad. And so I just, I talked over with people, and I said, they probably, even the people from Essa were probably pleading, would somebody please come and open a mill? I mean, because otherwise, why would William leave here? He was just over here. And why would he leave? He had a good farm, as far as we know, and he didn't know how to mill. But he sure learned. But, so anyway, we figured that's why they came up there. And then the first store opened 3 years later on the main street, a little general store. Somebody moved from West Essa, and then West Essa disappeared because people moved to Alliston. And the same with the train. When the train came up, even the first train came up, Rosemont died, Keenansville, Colgan, because originally they thought it was going to come up through Ballycroy, and I think maybe be on top of the escarpment, because I know they're not supposed to do hills, but anyway, they assumed it was going to be further west. But you had to pay to get the rail line through your community, and Tottenham came up with the goods. So it came up through Tottenham. And Alliston forked over $8,000, and that's how they got the branch line to begin with. So the community, and then the community, there was basically just farming communities around. But by 1876, there were a few more people around. But Everett, first of all these other communities sort of went kaput. Nicholston, hadn't grown very much anyway, and it died because of CPR. The Everett was originally on the first road west of Baseborden Road, on 15th Side Road, the one, the flashing light if you're familiar with the Baseborden Road. But the rail line came in 2 concession roads over. So the story goes, they just picked up Everett and moved it down to the rail station. So they were actually Old Everett and New Everett after 1877, 1878. So it's just amazing the power of the rail line, to be sure, from what I read anyway. But it certainly made a difference.
So, Thompsonville, there were mills there too.
Yes.
And what time period was that relative, like Alliston must have been first then? Because I've done a lot.
Well, my ancestry, the Kindlers, they started in Thompsonville. In fact, they farmed where the golf course is today in Broader Hill. But there was an active mill town, and Alex Grant, who had helped supervise the building of the Alliston mill, I think he went to Nicholston, no, I think he went up into the Essa someplace. I'm not sure if it was around Tiffin, where the Tiffin Park is. Then he ended up in Thompsonville and settled there to mill. And so he was a miller there, and that would be 1865, I think, maybe, about around
So
there.
after Alliston.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Do you know any history of the tobacco farming that used to go on in Alliston? Around Alliston was a lot of tobacco farms?
I haven't really got into it. I have a little bit of information. They came in after the war. And tobacco started in correct me if I'm wrong here, folks, in southwestern Ontario. And then they decided that this was a good place to grow it. And they came out, and I'm not sure just if there was any incentive, but I do know that there were tobacco farmers all over. When I was in high school, lots of kids started school late because they were picking. You know, it was the
And
new
they had the
leaves.
little house at the,
Little huts
And
everywhere.
the kilns.
Yeah.
Yes, the last one I think disappeared by the Honda plant, after the Honda plant came in, because there was always one on where the road used to be, where the Honda, before Honda shut it down.
But all of a sudden they switched from tobacco to potatoes, like overnight in like the 1960s
I have to
and 70s.
disagree. The potatoes started in 1920.
Okay.
The first man was a gentleman, John Mackenzie, and he grew like 5 or 6 acres, and everyone around thought he was going to go broke in a year. I could have the acreage wrong, but he grew the first quantity of potatoes. And all the rest of them decried his decision. They said, "You're not going to make any money." Well, he made money. And so potato farming really came into its own in the 1920s in Alliston. I've actually written the history, but there wasn't room in the book for all of that. But I do hope to produce it sometime, even if it's just as a reference. It's really interesting where it all started. The Ontario government, Department of Agriculture, then got heavily involved in pesticides and fertilizers. And you notice we have fertilizer plants here and around here now. But they would come up and teach the farmers about blight and all the rest of it, and how to grow healthier potatoes. And then it just expanded from there. And so people say that, we started with potatoes. Well, we started as a mill town, but we grew potatoes, and now I tell everybody we grow cars.
The tobacco and potatoes generally like the same soil, the sandy soil.
Oh, and of course the tobacco eventually died because the climate it just wasn't secure enough, right?
Well, because of the frost and whatever, the potatoes took over, right?
I remember talking to the wife of a potato farmer, and she said that they always budgeted 4 years over 5, because you could be pretty much guaranteed within a 5-year span you were going to lose a crop.
Right.
And it was a terrible job, going out picking. The kids would be stooped over. Awful job.
I think there was something also about some regulations that came in and it all moved down to Chatham or something. They bought the rights. There was something there, regulation-wise.
Yeah, because eventually it just died here in the 1970s. I would say it was about then.
But there was something about the regulation, and they could only grow so much or something. I forgot.
It was like not a cartel.
And they all moved, down where it was milder, which makes sense.
Yes, yes, and they still grow tobacco. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure would there be importing tobacco? Does that make sense? Or am I mixing it up?
Or exporting it.
No, I was just wondering if there was competition, but I don't remember. I honestly don't know that much about it, and it was only what was in the newspaper. But I've lived where I live since 1946, so I was at school from the 50s and 60s, and in high school in the early 60s. And all the kids came in from the farms, there was with the district school, and lots of them were affected by the tobacco season. And they would go out early to plant as well.
So how long was the Salada potato chip plant there?
Okay, so Salada Sheriff Horsey built their plant in 1959 at the south end of Church Street, which now It's now a car parts plant, imagine that. Right across from the fire station and the ball field on Church Street. They came in 1959, and they not only contracted to farmers, but they also bought farms as well, so they be guaranteed the amount of produce that they needed. To finish the processing for potato plants, is anyone familiar with potato lagoons? All right, it's an awful story. I actually have a chapter in the book on waste management and sewage, because it was a huge issue between the aging sewage plant on the bend of the CPR line. It was down there. I think there's still something in there now. It had the most god-awful smells coming out of it on a hot summer night, starting in the late 50s and going into the late 60s. So we get a little bit, because I lived west of there, so prevailing westerlies, yes. But if you went east of town, you could smell it. And some people, they go to council, they said, we actually had to leave our home last night. We couldn't stand it. It was that putrid. And can you imagine? And it overflowed. At the same time, they built 3 potato lagoons about where Parsons Road is now. And where the mighty Alliston Herald used to be, down in that, on the south end of Dufferin Street, just on the other side of the tracks. And they were supposed to be processed naturally, and Mother Nature would take over, and it was all lovely. Well, if you can imagine what 3 potato lagoons of rotting potato skins smell like. I can remember playing tennis, which is just, the tennis courts are just south of Banting on Albert Street, and the lagoons would have just been there. And even into the 70s, they were still trying to figure out how to get the smell out. And there were ducks on the pond, and we thought, God, did the ducks live? But between a south wind off the potato lagoons or a north wind off the sewage plant, I mean, it was terrible at the east end of town. And they finally got a new sewage plant, and the Solander finally folded up. They finally left, I think, in the early 1980s. And it was just about that time Honda came in, and I think it was then that their plant was eventually converted into some car parks, different than now, windshields at one point, I think. No, they were the only plant in Canada, I believe, that made instant mashed potatoes. Sheriff Instant Mashed Potatoes. You can still buy them. Yum, yum.
I don't know if anybody else did, but we used to go, they gave us bus tour, kids over from school. So we did the tour on
to the
that
potato
plant
to the mashed potatoes.
I don't know if anybody else got
And
a
I
tour,
don't-
but it was interesting. And I remember the potato sheets of these instant mashed potatoes coming off big rollers.
Yeah, very.
And potato chips, similar.
There was potato chips too, was there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The first potato chip was sold in Alliston at the gas station that used to be where the Shell station is today, I believe, in 1932. And somebody came in and sold it to the man that owned it, whose name was Sandy Ellis, and he thought they were pretty good. So he drove to Newmarket or something to get some more, and they've been selling potato chips here ever since. And Miss Vicky sold her first test packages here at the Potato Festival. Miss Vicky Kerr was up in New Lowell, and she was the inventor of Miss Vicky's potato chips. Best potato chips ever. And she started selling, I think, about the mid-1980s. And look at Miss Vicky's today. You know, it's all over the place. And she lives in Arizona, apparently. Teaches.
What do you know about Baxter Labs? How did they end up in Alliston? And what did they produce?
Intravenous. And they still do. And Baxter Labs is an international company. My daughter was visiting friends in Norway, and I went with her. And we're driving in from the Norway airport, and we're going along a plaza, and they don't look much different than some of ours here today. And I had Baxter Lab. My God, did I leave home? And so they're all over the world. And down here they make intravenous, and they have a really good record, apparently, of what it is that they produce. And they came in, I think, the early 60s, 1960s.
No, the late 50s.
Late 50s? Oh, okay. I thought it was around there. Okay, they came around.
I helped unload some of the equipment. It came from Acton.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. And they still have a large staff in there, I guess, and, you know, and produce intravenous, and I don't know what else they do. Yeah, they came in around the same time as Salada Sheriff.
Yeah.
They had a better reputation than Salada Sheriff. Yeah, so Baxter Labs are still going strong, yeah.
Did you see the movie Glory Enough for All and Dr. Banting?
Oh, I might have.
I remember I was involved with it, and this is years ago, a little bit. And I'm wondering if that movie is still around in the museum or whatever. And it's called Glory Enough for All, Dr. Banting, Dr. Bell.
Is it the one that was partly filmed up here in the house over on Nelson
As
Street?
far as I know, yes.
Lawrence Lindsay's house, because they moved him out to the Nottawasaga for 2 weeks, paid for all his expenses while they redecorated his house so they could do the film in the front lobby.
The reason being Dr. Banting evidently had a Maxwell car, and they used my Maxwell car as Dr. Banting's car.
Oh, for goodness sake, oh.
The movie was called Glory Enough for All, and that was done, I think, in the 1980s. It's a long time ago.
Yeah,
Was
with
it
the around there.
CBC or?
I don't know who did it. I think it might have been this, was it CBC?
I think it was
It's on
CBC.
YouTube.
Might be in their archives. Or in a vehicle.
It's on the
Is
computer.
that right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
if
it's
you,
found, it's on YouTube. It's called Glory Enough for All, 1988, full movie, part 1 of 2.
oh, good, yeah.
And only 1,900 people have watched it.
I thought you were gonna say it was $1,900.
That was the population of Alliston when they watched it.
Oh, so it was 19, I remember when they did it, because it was a great excitement about the Lindsay House being used. It was just west of the old Alliston Memorial Arena. The book, I also talk a little bit about the memorials around town. But as I say, I ran out of room. The murals on the wall of the Alliston Arena. And the Alliston Arena was put up in 1950. But there's also a wonderful story about the Women's Institute doing everything they could for the boys that we lost in the First World War when they built the Alliston Memorial Library. And it opened on February 14th, 1924, and Dr. Frederick Banting, who wasn't knighted at the time, cut the ribbon. And they plodded for 5 years to build the building. Do you want me to shut up? I mean, I don't know. At the time, Carnegie, from the United States, a steel magnate, decided that he wanted to fund libraries throughout North America. And they actually had a chance to get a Carnegie library here, but it couldn't be called a memorial library, and it wasn't of chaste design. And it had to look like a Carnegie library. And the Women's Institute said, no, we won't take the $5,000, we will raise our own money, and it will be of chaste design in memory of our boys. Like, it's just a really touching story. It brings tears to my eyes, and I actually wrote it, and I'm thinking, we gotta get over this. But it's a really great story about the commitment to the fellows that died in the First World War. And so it's really important that the Alliston Library in some way be saved somehow, because it was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into the building.
Now, I'm thinking the modern library,
It was, they actually had to tear it down and rebuild it in 1982, I believe it was.
in the same spot.
In the same spot. And they went to the Women's Institute and they said, we can't save the building. It's not worth it. And they said, well, it's still there for the same purpose and it's still in memory of our boys. And so we will give you the okay to tear the building down. They didn't have any choice, but it was a nice thing to them. And one of the ladies who was a leader in the first campaign to open it in 1924 cut the ribbon in 1982, Mina Stewart, and she died the next year. But she saw the life of the library. So they gave their blessing to the new library because it would still provide a service to the town. But it's a great story. In the Alliston Memorial Arena, 100 people shingled the roof in one day. All volunteers. No insurance, no nothing. Just come along, climb the ladder. I'm sure you'll be safe. And the 3 octogenarians in town, there was a Mr. Hand, and I forget someone else, and my grandfather, who was an old codger at age 80, were still there at 10 o'clock at night, hammering away. And it was all kinds of blood, sweat, and tears that put up the Alliston Memorial Arena. You know, it was all volunteer help, and the farmers all came in with their equipment and helped get it started, and up it went. And there's talk in town of them, there's new councillors that don't know the history of the Memorial Arena and think it should go down. There was a great to-do about 20 years ago, they were going to tear it down. I figured out, oh well, maybe if they renovated it, they can make use of it. So there's all kinds of stuff at the arena, it's just no ice. So, anyway, lots of history in every little town.
Yeah. Could you just explain how did you do all this? It's amazing.
Well, I was a member of the Alliston Historical Society, but I was working, and so I was busy, so I went to meetings, and that was all. When I retired in '06, I was the coordinator at Central Village in New Eden at the supportive housing apartment building, and I retired from there, and they knew that I had a historical background as well. As Janine said, it was my great-great-grandfather in Hornsby who actually got the 100 acres deeded to him in 1840, and I have the deed in my house from 1840. It's Queen Victoria has granted this property, you know. He never met the Queen. So I've always, my grandfather was the reeve for 15 years, he was a mayor for 2 years, he owned the electric light plant, he was the miller, he built all the bridges. The Church Street Bridge is named the Cunningham Bridge in memory of all his volunteer bridge building. And he was just an old codger that he just got things done. And when Mr. Loblaw built his hospital, he didn't think the town was doing enough to fix up Fletcher Crescent. So if you walk along the sidewalk in Fletcher Crescent, there's a retaining wall against the houses that go up just next to the hospital. By gar, he put them in 1929 because the town wasn't going to do it. And if they weren't going to lay the sidewalk, he put it in himself. Hey, crikey. So I've heard these stories, and some of them, we hired a student to do interviews in 1999-2000 through the Historical Society, and we sort of just gave her questions. We found the oldest people in town, and we just gave her some standard questions, but we said go anywhere with the interviews. Well, she transcribed 600 pages of interviews, and I read them, and the questions that were all similar, nobody had the same answer. But everybody, like the telephone game, all comes back screwed up. So I said to them, we can't use this as research. We can use it for vignettes and little things that, it doesn't matter. But I said, there's no way, because the Historical Society actually formed, I gather, in order to write the history of Alliston. So here we are. Then in 2008, I said, okay, I'm going to start researching. Well, I didn't know what to look for, so I went up to Jean Baker Pierce, who had owned the newspaper. It's just thank goodness for her. She had all of the microfilm reproduced that's in the Simcoe County Archives, and it's the same in the Ontario Archives, reproduced, and they're in the Alliston Library. So in 10 minutes, I could leave my front door and have a reel of the machine. And for 3 years, I walked the ramp up to the microfilm machine, and I read 4,000 Alliston Heralds. And I started in 1871, which was the Star. There's only about 50 papers, because every time there was a fire, newspapers are gone. So there was only about 50 up until about 1910, and then there were basically 50 every year after that, to 1991, which is when Alliston supposedly went kaput, as a municipality. It did. So that was sort of my deadline and my cutting off point. So I read the newspapers for 4,000 of them. And so it was great on microfilm, actually, because you can isolate what you want to copy. So I had 8,000 sheets of paper, because I can tell by how much I paid for them. And I had 8,000 pages, and sometimes there were 4 articles, and sometimes there was 1. And there was really only about 4 or 5 pages in any paper that was Alliston news. A lot of the inserts were done in Toronto and sent up way back in the day, so everybody had the same inserts for international news, and the local news was on, 1, 2, 5, and 6 or something. So I got to know where the news was. I read Social Notes by the column because that's where the good stuff was. And I started putting all the pieces together. And the more I went along, it got boring, but every now and then in the library they'd hear, oh! And I said, oh yes, yes, that happened in 1932, and I'm in 1955. Yes, I got it. And so there was just enough gems that I kept going and did all 4,000 of them. So I have 18 boxes at home, and the book that I just showed you is 4 boxes. So what happens the rest of them, we'll wait and see.
Oh, I'm going to interrupt you right now. This has just been such an experience. I've just been sitting on the edge of my seat the whole time.
I hope it's all right.
Oh, no.
Of course, what does anybody know?
It was
We're
quiet
so-
and it wasn't because we were sleeping.
All of us here are so lucky to have had such an engaging person who has, she's a great puzzle person. She knows just so much. And this book that she's done, you know, that's a gift. I know it's $70 may sound like a lot, but there's so much has gone into that book that it's, all the libraries should certainly have a copy, and I'm sure a lot of our members will.
I will be donating to each of the libraries.
Yes, yes. So I'm really speechless because it's been an awesome experience for me personally. And it's interesting because I don't live in Alliston, but I've been to Alliston enough, and you were so clear about pointing out, look, this place, so that's where it used to be, and this place. And I thought, oh, I know that place. I remember that place. So I felt quite involved because you were very clear about that, and I think people like to know, you know, what it's like now and what it was like then and all the transitions it's been through. But something about, you said contact, and you said where the toys are. I'm going to go in there now.
Yeah, it's fun.
And I'm going to say, now what is it that I'm supposed to be looking for?
And you won't be the first one because they're aware that it's the,
They know there's
some
something in
staff anyway know it's the vault. But if you just walk in the main door and go to the east wall on the left side, you'll see the toy room, and that's the vault.
Oh, I'll go in there.
Yeah, it's just sort of cool.
So on behalf of the Tecumseh and West Millbury Historical Society, thank you, Carolyn.
Thanks.